Welcome to This is the Day with Mike Rogers.
This is the day that the Lord hath made, that the Lord hath made.
The prophet Isaiah tells us that the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, who shall stand as a banner for the people, for the Gentiles shall seek him. And friends, I'm here to tell you, this is the day. Welcome back to the podcast. If you've been following this series, you know we haven't been studying prophecy out of curiosity or speculation. We've been carefully building a prophetic model from the text of Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, reading it in its historical and covenantal context. Let me briefly remind you where we've been. Jesus predicted the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2. The disciples responded with two connected questions. When will these things happen, and what will be the sign? We saw that the phrase, these things, consistently refers back to the temple's fall. The structure of the discourse as a chiasm keeps the entire conversation anchored to that event. And the language of the Son of Man coming draws from Daniel's imagery of covenantal judgment and enthronement. It signifies his presence with the church in the age following the temple's fall, not a single event at the end of world history. In other words, the context is covenantal. The focus is Jerusalem. The time frame is the disciples' generation. Now, why does this matter? Because this prophetic model shapes how we see almost everything in God's redemptive plan. First, it gives us a vision for the future of the world before the resurrection. If Jesus' most dramatic warnings were fulfilled in the first century, then we are not living under a constant expectation of imminent global collapse. We are living in the established kingdom age, an age of mission, inheritance, and growth. Second, it provides a powerful apologetic tool for defending the Christian faith. Critics like Bertrand Russell claimed Jesus was a false prophet because they assumed he predicted the end of the world within his generation. But if he was predicting the fall of Jerusalem, and that event occurred exactly as he said, then the accusation fails. Instead of being mistaken, Jesus is vindicated. Third, this framework helps us value the spiritual inheritance we've received. The temple fell, the old covenant system passed away. What remains is the messianic kingdom, the church as God's dwelling place. That inheritance is not fragile. It is something we steward and pass on to future generations. Fourth, it clarifies the Bible itself. Many New Testament passages that seem confusing began to make sense when we recognized the covenantal transition from the Mosaic age to the Messianic age. It informs statements like Paul made to the church at Corinth about living at the end of the ages, 1 Corinthians 10:11. And fifth, it energizes the church's mission. If we are not waiting for inevitable decline and catastrophe, then we are free and obligated to obey Christ's Great Commission in Matthew 28:18 through 20, and make disciples of the nations with confidence. The kingdom has come, Christ reigns, and according to Psalm 82:8, he shall inherit all nations, and he is using the church to do so. That's the larger vision. So today, as we return to Matthew 24 and examine what Jesus calls the beginning of birth pains, we're not merely analyzing ancient events. We're clarifying our view of history, defending Christ's credibility, strengthening the church, and grounding our mission. Now let's move into the text. Jesus' answer to the sign question. In Matthew 24, 4 through 31, Jesus answers the disciples' question about the sign. And as he does, two clear patterns emerge. First, he moves from general to specific geography. The signs begin across all the world, then narrow to Israel and Jerusalem, and finally converge on the temple itself. Second, he moves from literal to figurative language. He begins with straightforward descriptions, wars, famines, persecution, and as he approaches the temple's destruction, his language crescendos into prophetic imagery, lightning, vultures, cosmic collapse. The imagery is drawn from the Old Testament prophets and intensifies as the focal point approaches. Both patterns point to one conclusion. Jesus is describing the fall of Jerusalem's temple, the end of the Mosaic age, not the end of history. He begins with what he calls the beginning of birth pains. Phase 1. Preliminary signs. These preliminary signs fall into two categories: general conditions that would characterize the transition period, and specific developments that would affect the disciples in their mission. Let's start with the general signs. General preliminary signs. Religious deceivers. Jesus warns, "Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and shall deceive many." Matthew 24, 5. Deception was nothing new in Israel's history. Balaam had misled the people. False prophets in Jeremiah's day promised peace when judgment was imminent. Jeremiah 14 records God rebuking prophets who claimed divine authority, but who spoke lies. So when Jesus predicts religious deceivers, he isn't describing something unprecedented. He is saying this pattern will continue during the transition period. And historically, it did. Writers like Justin Martyr mention figures such as Simon Magus, who claimed divine status. Scholars like G.K. Beale and historians like Sir William Ramsay document pseudo-miracles and religious trickery throughout the empire. Even near the temple's destruction, figures like Apollonius of Tyana were associated with claims of supernatural power. Within Judea itself, impostors like Theudas and the Egyptian prophet mentioned in the book of Acts gathered followers and promised deliverance. Jesus' point is simple. Do not mistake religious deception for the decisive sign. These things would occur, but they would not mean the temple's fall was immediate. Social unrest. Next, Jesus speaks of wars and rumors of wars. When he said this, Rome was relatively stable, but within a generation, the empire descended into turmoil. In a single year, Rome saw a rapid succession of emperors. Nero committed suicide in June of AD 68. Soldiers of the Praetorian Guard murdered Galba in January of 69. Otho committed suicide in April of that year, and army troops murdered Vitellius in December. Vespasian then became the 10th emperor and restored order in the empire. Civil war shook the empire. Violent uprisings erupted in Judea. Bloodshed spread across cities like Alexandria and Damascus. Yet Jesus said, "See that you are not troubled. The end is not yet." Wars would characterize the period, but they were not the signal event. Physical disturbances. Then come famines, pestilences, and earthquakes. Acts 11 records a famine during the reign of Claudius. Ancient sources describe devastating earthquakes in cities like Laodicea and Hierapolis. The empire experienced fire, plague, and natural disasters in the decades before AD 70. Modern prophecy teachers sometimes point to natural disasters today as evidence that Matthew 24 is unfolding in our time. But Jesus was describing the period between his ministry and Jerusalem's destruction, and the historical record confirms that those signs occurred in that generation. The beginning of birth pains. Jesus summarizes these events with one phrase, the beginning of birth pains. The prophets had used this imagery to describe covenantal judgment. Isaiah used it for Babylon, Jeremiah used it for Moab and Edom, Micah used it for God's previous judgment of Jerusalem herself. Birth pains signal suffering, but also transition. Something old is passing, something new is being born. 3 days after delivering this Olivet Discourse, Jesus accomplished the deliverance Israel had failed to produce through his death and resurrection. Then Israel's temple-centered system would enter its final travail, culminating in AD 70. These were the opening contractions of that judgment. Specific preliminary signs. Jesus then narrows his focus to signs directly affecting the disciples' ministry, persecution, apostasy, and worldwide gospel proclamation. Persecution. You will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Acts records the fulfillment. The apostles were imprisoned, beaten, stoned, and killed. They were opposed by Jewish authorities and brought before Gentile rulers. Paul later wrote in 1 Thessalonians that the Jews were filling up their sins and that wrath had come upon them to the uttermost, echoing Jesus' warning in Matthew 23 that that generation would complete the measure of their father's guilt. This persecution was not random suffering. It was part of the covenantal transition leading to the end of the Mosaic age. Widespread apostasy. Jesus warned that many would fall away and that false prophets would multiply. The New Testament confirms it. Peter warned of false teachers. The book of Hebrews urged believers not to shrink back as judgment approached. Paul spoke of co-workers who abandoned him and named false teachers undermining the faith, men like Hymenaeus, Philetus, and Demas. The apostasy was not a distant future event. It was unfolding in their lifetime, another birth pain. The gospel to all nations. Finally, Jesus declared, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then the end will come." Matthew 24:14. This was kingdom proclamation, a witness that the age was changing and judgment was coming. And the New Testament repeatedly represents this as accomplished. As we consider this sign, we need to understand that Jesus was not speaking about the entire earth as we know it. He used a word for world, oikomene, that meant the Roman Empire. It's the same word Luke used in his account of Jesus' birth. It came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world, oikomene, should be registered, Luke 2:1. With this in mind, we can understand Paul's universal language when he tells the Romans that their faith was known throughout the whole world. He told the Colossians the gospel had been preached to every creature under heaven. By the mid-60s, Christianity was spoken against everywhere in the Roman Empire. The witness had gone out, and Jesus said when that happened, the end would come, not the end of history, but the end of the Mosaic age connected to the temple's fall. Pulling it together, the preliminary signs, deception, unrest, disasters, persecution, apostasy, worldwide proclamation, all fit within the disciples' generation. They confirm the prophetic framework we've established. They do not describe the end of the church age. They do not describe 21st century headlines. They describe the turbulent decades leading to AD 70, the beginning of birth pains. Next, we'll move from these preliminary signs to the signs that occurred just before the temple's fall, where Jesus' language intensifies and the focus narrows fully to Jerusalem. We're moving closer to the climax. Thanks for listening, and we'll pick up here next time. Until then, my friends, thank you for listening again, and rejoice, for this is the day the Lord has made.
This is the day that the Lord hath made.